Hello everybody, welcome to this video. We are going to cover RShiny in this video, the very basics of it, including how to set up your user interface. And so RShiny is a great tool for building dashboards and interactive web applets. So we have a pretty good idea how to read our data in, combine it, and manipulate it. We have a good idea how to create some basic summaries and visualizations. And what we're ready to do at this point is create these new different ways to share our analysis or our data. So what is RShiny? Let's first figure out that. Well, it's a package that was built through RStudio and developed by those folks. And like I said, it's going to allow us to create interactive web apps. And the way we're going to do it is basically we're going to create a folder that has two R scripts in it. And one R script is going to define what we call the user interface, and that's what the user is going to see on the web page. And one is going to define the R functions that run in the background and actually do all of the computations, and that's going to be the server.r file. There is a way to do this in a single R script, but I personally like the two-file structure because I think it separates things nicely for us. And the really great thing about RStudio or RShiny is that it doesn't require us to know any HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, although if you do know those things, you can really customize your apps. Luckily, there's a lot of people out there that have built other packages on top of Shiny that will allow you to have different functionality you might want. And so remember, the usefulness of having R running in the background is that we can actually do computations on the fly. So we talked about having HTML output, which is in itself dynamic. We saw we had maps on there that we could move around. We could do lots of things like that. But if we wanted to actually do any of the R computations in the background, fit a regression model dynamically as the user changes things, the website, the HTML code does not have that functionality. And so R running in the background of these is great because it gives us way more functionality, but it does have the drawback that we are now going to have R running in the background to do these fancier calculations that we want. Okay, so here's an example app just to show you what this is all about. So here is a histogram and it has a density curve estimated over it. And so we can change the bandwidth adjustment on the density curve to make it take into account more values or less values around it. And we can also change the number of bins in our histogram dynamically. So I'm just changing this what we call widget, and it's changing the output you see down here. And so what we're going to basically be able to do is create, say, an HTML page, a web page, that has this kind of functionality. It won't actually be an HTML page, but it's the kind of idea, right? We're going to have this web page that we're going to have the user be able to go in, change some things. Again, we're going to call those things widgets. So they're going to change these widgets. We're going to have R code running in the background to update based off of how those widgets change. And then we're going to see new dynamic updated values or plots. Okay, so why are we trying to learn RShiny? Well, one, you have a pretty good idea about how R works at this point. We already know how to write our own functions, which is really the key to opening up how to use R. And so since we already have that background, learning RShiny is not that bad. It's just learning a little bit of a few new functions that are specific to RShiny, but the ideas that are used in them are very similar to writing your own functions and passing lists back and forth. And this is a great way to share your analysis, allow users to explore a data set that you have, or what I tend to use it for is to explain statistical concepts in a teaching mode. And so here's an example app that you might have. And so over on the left, there's a dashboard bar. And so you could have many more tabs over here. I only have one at this point, one variable regression. There's a little menu button here to hide or show that. And then within this, I have an app here to basically fit a regression line to these variables for a data set. This was a data set about river sediment or something like that in China. And so you can choose different variables from that data set and then fit regression equations if you want. So if I click this, it now adds a regression line here and puts the fitted regression equation and the coefficient information for the model down here. And I can change the degree of the polynomial up to 4 in this particular case. So this is fitting a simple linear regression model of that. Here's the fitted line, and here's information about the coefficients. And so, basically, if you wanted to have your users be able to go in here, pick some different variables, and do these kinds of things, this is a great way to do it. All right, so what is our basic game plan for developing these Shiny apps? Like I said, we already know the R code that's going to go behind the scenes in terms of creating a plot or putting two text strings together, that kind of thing. We just need to figure out how to do this in this R Shiny framework. And so the first thing to do is to just take some time and look through some online repositories and resources for existing apps. That way you can get an idea about what's possible or what you might want to do. And so I'll have some links on the next slide about that. And then we're going to create some basic apps. Just first, we're going to start with the UI. So that's what this presentation is about. Just how do I set up your basic user interface? How do I set up what the user who's going to go to this app, what they're going to see? And then we're going to talk about doing the R stuff on the back end and how they talk back and forth. And beyond that, we'll talk about customizing the apps to have a more dynamic user interface where we can have different sections show up when users do things. For instance, if I uncheck this fit regression equation here, that little box here disappears. But when I check it, it comes back. And so that's a more dynamic UI. And then after that, we'll just look at some common issues that come up and how to deal with those and talk about how to deploy your app or make it available for people to look at. Okay, so like I said, what we want to do is start by looking at what's out there. And so what I would do here is pause your video, go to the presentation, click on these different links, just browse about and see what kind of things are out there that you might want to look at. Okay, so hopefully you checked out some different apps and you're pretty excited about learning this R Shiny. So what do we need to get started? Well, of course we need R, and it's easiest to do this through RStudio. You don't really need it, but that's how we'll deal with it. We need the Shiny package, which comes with RStudio. And there are a bunch of other packages that can make the applet that you build look nicer. And so one of them is Shiny Dashboard, which is that red applet that you saw here is built through Shiny Dashboard. This one here, for instance, is not. So it's just a different theme for it. The Shiny Dashboard allows you to have this easy way to create a menu that would allow you to switch through different tabs. So I recommend that one. And then DT for creating nice tables. And we've already seen this in just our regular old HTML output. Those DT tables are sortable. We can search through them, all those kinds of things. So definitely I would use DT table, the DT library to create tables. Okay, so like I mentioned before, these apps really just have two parts to them. And that's why I like the two-file structure. So we have an user interface or UI that defines what the user sees when they go to the app. And then the server, which runs on the back end and does all the computations in R code that you might need. There's a visual. Yeah, so UI, what you see. Server is actually doing the computations in the background. So we're going to, again, refer to these widgets, which are just items that users can interact with. Okay, so your UI is going to determine where those widgets show up and where the plots that you do show up as well. Or, text or whatever summaries that you're going to produce. The server, on the other hand, this contains the R code that's going to run for your app. So if you're fitting a histogram, it's going to actually have the code to do that there. Again, you can do this with a single file if you name your file app.r, but we're going to use separate files in a folder created for a given app that you want. So we're going to maybe create an example app folder 1, and then we're going to put UI and server files in there and build those up. So a little bit more about the structure of the folders that you want to have. I like to have a folder called Shiny Apps, and then within that folder I have a folder for each app that I am going to create. And within each one of those apps folders, I do have the UI and server files. So here's a picture of that, if you will. So I have a Shiny Apps folder that has all of my different apps in it. So I have a basic Bayes app, a Delta Method app, etc., etc. And then within each one of these folders, there's a UI and a server file, along with whatever other helper files I might have, images for those apps, etc., etc. So again, this is the structure that we're going to use, or I would like us to use. You can use the one file if you'd like, but we're going to have, I like to use a broad folder for all of my apps. Within there, I have a different folder for each one of my apps, and then within each one of those folders, I have a server and a UI.r file. Okay, so let's start with how do we build our user interface? How do we build what the user sees? And so this is the most basic type of layout that you might use for your user interface file. At the top, we're going to just read in the Shiny package. So we're going to do library Shiny. And then beyond that, we're going to store a UI. So we're going to create an object UI within this script. And we're going to create a fluid page, which is just going to allow it to dynamically interact with the size of the screen. And so like if a user uses their mobile phone to access the app, it's going to look different than if you used a web page. So this is a very standard way to do things these days, have fluid pages. And so we might have a title panel that goes at the top, and then a sidebar layout, a very basic sidebar layout where we have a sidebar panel on the left and then a main panel on the right. We usually put our widgets and things the user interacts with on the left, and then the output like the plots, etc. on the right. So what that looks like, up here we now have a title panel where we can put the title of our app. We have a sidebar panel that gets this grayed in area, and then we have our main panel that comes up over here. So again, this file creates that basic setup. So we have title panel, we would put quoted string of whatever title we want in there. Sidebar layout is a special way to set up your app. And for the sidebar layout, you have two pieces to it, a sidebar panel and then a main panel. Okay, so what are the most basic things you need for your server file? Well, this is the most basic thing that you could have for your server file. Again, at the top of that, we're going to do library Shiny to make sure that that package is read in for this file. And then we use Shiny server, which is a function from that package. It's a function of input, output, and then we're going to add the session argument. And within here is where we would put the R code that we're going to run dynamically. But we could leave that blank, and that would create these two files that you see here, would create your most basic app with nothing going on. Now, of course, we're not usually going to build our apps from scratch like that. I just wanted to show you the most bare bones kind of structure that you might use. RStudio, of course, has these wonderful templates that allow us to sort of see one of these apps in practice. So go ahead and go to File, New File, Shiny Web App, and then I would choose here Multiple File App. And you can put it in whatever directory you want. Again, I would create a larger folder to hold all of your apps in. Okay, so hopefully you've now done that, and this is what you would see at this point. So you will have two files if you did the two file structure, and here's your first one. It takes that same exact layout that we just looked at. It saves a UI object, fluid page, title panel at the top, Old Faithful Geyser Data. And then it's using a default sidebar layout. So that needs a sidebar panel and a main panel. In the sidebar panel, we're putting one widget. In this case, it's a slider widget. And we'll look at the different functions and widgets we might add in a little bit. We'll talk about, of course, the insides of here as well. And then within the main panel, we're going to put a plot. Okay, so we're going to have a plot output. Now this needs to correspond, since it's an output, this needs to correspond to something that's created within your server file. So again, we're going to talk about all of those things as we go. Here's your server file. So this is using a slightly different syntax. So you could use either the one I showed you in the previous or this one. So here we're saving a server object, a function of input and output. And within here, we're putting the code that creates the plot. So we're creating an output object, distplot, that, notice here, we are calling in our plot output in the UI. So you can see that this is a pretty complicated idea, right? We have these two different things. We have the UI and the server, and we need to know how to pass information back and forth to them. We need to know the syntax of each one of these widgets. We need to know how to add multiple widgets to, say, a given sidebar panel or things like that. So we do have quite a bit to learn here, but all of it's going to follow our basic R ideas, right? The syntax isn't going to be that much different. So the key here is we're using a special render plot function from the Shiny library, and so basically this just needs to return something that is a plot type object. And so the last thing that we're doing here is a histogram. And since this is the last thing we do, very similar to an R function, that's the thing that gets returned. So this is going to return that histogram that will then be outputted in the UI. How do you run your app? Well, whenever you have a UI.R or server.R or app.R file in RStudio, there's a Run App button at the top that comes up in your script editor window. And so you can just click that and you can run your app there. Alternatively, for instance, I have a Shiny Apps folder I keep all of my Shiny apps in. You could set your working directory there, load the Shiny package, and then use the Run App function. Of course, you could use Run App and then just give the path name to the folder that has the UI and server files. But in this case, this is the folder name that has a UI and server file in it. Notice that if you run your app, so go ahead and pause the video here, run your app. If you do so, you will see that it ties up your R console. You're not able to actually submit any other R code. And that's because it has to actually take up that R console in order to do the computations on the back end. And so if you want to get your R console back, or you want to close the app, you can either close the app using the X button that comes up, or you can just hit escape when you're in your console and it will close down that app. Either one of those two things will get you back to your usual console. So again, I would stop the video here, take a minute, run the template app, play around with it, sort of take a look at the file that's there in the background and see how it's working. Okay, just to show you the process of running the app, let's go ahead and just load in the default app. I'm going to use the multiple file app. I'm going to put it in a folder just like I had before, Shiny Apps. Just call this temp, create that. And so now you see the two UI and server files that they build for us. And you can also see the Run App button. So if you click Run App, it will open up a new window where you see your app and you can actually play around with it. And there's also, if you notice in the top middle area, top left area, there's an open in browser. So that would open in your default browser. You could also see here that while the app was running, it said it was listening at that local address. And so that's tying up the R console. You wouldn't actually be able to submit any R code during that time. So if you close the app or just hit escape when you see that, it will close your app and you'll gain access to your console again. All right, let's talk about the kinds of things that you're normally going to put in your user interface or UI file. Basically, they boil down to what you see here. So plain strings of text that you might want to add, so just text to sort of explain something to your user. Widgets, and we'll look at all the different widgets that are sort of built into the Shiny package in just a minute. But remember that widgets are the things that the user can actually interact with. And then, of course, we can do things very similar to R Markdown, where we can add formatted text. Unfortunately, it's not the exact same notation that we saw in R Markdown. The notation used in the Shiny package is much more similar to the HTML notation. And so you do have to learn a little bit more about this if you want to have nicer, more formatted text. But you can see the ideas are the same. There's this P function, so you'd use P open parenthesis to do a paragraph of text. There's headers. Instead of having pound signs, we're using H1 for a first level header down to H6. We have A for hyperlink instead of the usual square bracket open parenthesis notation for R Markdown. And so this is kind of annoying. These packages were not built sort of at the same time with the same idea of functionality. But they all do this, they can do the same thing, whether you're using R Markdown or whether you're using the Shiny. It's just you got to switch your syntax. So annoying, but you can still do whatever you need to do there. And so plain text strings, formatted text strings, widgets, which the user can interact with, and then output from the server file. Those are the four main things that you might add into your user interface. And really, if you want to add, say, multiple widgets or multiple different text strings in there, all you have to do is separate the items with a comma. And so the syntax here is really actually going to be pretty easy for us. We put whatever we want separated by commas within, say, a sidebar panel or a main panel, and that's exactly how you do it. And so let's talk about the widgets, because that's going to be the first sort of most interesting thing to add. We are going to add whatever text we need to add, but the widgets are the things that the user can actually interact with. And these are going to be added using something input functions for the most part. So there's going to be like a slider input, numeric input, etc., etc. And so, just like I said on the previous one, we're going to separate these widgets and other things by commas in your UI file. So these are the different widgets that you might look at. Most of them end in input, except a couple ones that for some reason they changed the syntax on, such as action button and radio buttons. But other than that, they used input as the last part, and so these are the basic ones that come built into Shiny. One thing about notation, if you're ever building your own package and things, it's probably better to put the word that is common to all of these things first. So to put like input and then the name of the input type second. Reason being that if you don't remember the exact name of the input, you can just put input and then use the tab to do completion, and then it would show you all things that started with input, and you'd be able to just sort of tab through that list and figure out what you wanted to add. So again, if you were to build your own package, I don't know if you're ever going to do that, but I would put input first and then the name after that. That way you can just tab through the different options when you're in RStudio, for instance. Okay, but hopefully you have a pretty good idea about the types of things that you can add just based off of this. Here's a little Shiny app. So this is a Shiny app within the slides here to just look through the different widgets themselves. And so I have a select box here that goes through and you can pick the different widgets. I have almost all of them included here, but you have a button. This is what the button looks like. So you can click that button. You can actually see the code that I used to create that button right here. And then this is what Shiny returns, and this is what you'd actually end up accessing in your server file. So this will be more useful for us later once we get a better handle of things. But as I hit the click here button, notice that it's changing the counter on this action button. If I switch to checkbox, I just have a checkbox with a title to it. And so if I click that, it switches from false to true. Here's the code that I used to create that. So again, we're going to talk more about the different values you see in here. But basically, this is a nice little app to just sort of see the different things that you would do and what our Shiny returns to you. So here, if I do option A and B, it returns a vector with option A is the first element, B is the second. Over here on the right is actually the help. This is scraped off the web, which was kind of fun to build in there. But this is the help corresponding to that widget. And so you can see that here are the different elements that you want to put into your function call. All of these start with an input ID, which is the internal name that you're giving this particular input. A label, which is what the user actually sees. So here, my internal name is CBG, checkbox group. And then the label, the thing that the user actually sees, I'm using a third level header. So this is H3, and then a string of text, select from the choices below. And that H3 just creates larger text here, right? Beyond that, for checkbox group input, you need to give it choices that the user might actually want to choose from. So you can see that down here. Selected, so if you want anything to be selected by default, you can give a list there. And then there's some other options as well. So this might be a good time, if you're curious, to just take 2 or 3 minutes, go through these, see the code that's used to bring them up, look at the different inputs, see how every one of them has an input ID and a label, and then sort of just get an idea about the other things that they might be asking for, and then check what gets returned here. So if I input a date here, this returns this character string. So again, probably would pause the video here, take a minute or two, play around with this. Okay, so again, we have these sort of 4 things that we might be adding to our UI file. Plain text, formatted text, widgets, which are those things the user can play around with, and then things that are produced by the server file. So we do need to sort of figure out how the server and UI are going to talk to one another. And so we'll be doing that in just a second. Here are the different functions that sort of correspond to the server and UI file. So on the left, these are the functions that you would put in a server file to create something that would then be outputted into the UI file. So there's only a sort of a set class of things that you can do with the R code. So you can create a data table. So this is using the DT package. Notice that notation says DT package render data table. And so this is what you'd put in your server file over here. And on the right, this is what you'd put in your UI file. You'd put a data table output as one of your entries in your UI. There's an image. You can render a plot. You can render print. Very basic way to just print out things. Render table, which again I wouldn't use. I would just use render data table. You can just render text, and then you can render UI, which is a very fancy way to do things, and we'll look at doing that a little bit later. But again, the key here is these functions on the left are what goes into your server file. These functions on the right are what goes into your UI file to correspond to the output. So if I render an image in my server file, I give it a name, so I'm going to store that as some sort of object name, and then I'm going to do image output and call that output ID. So it's going to take the output from that and then be able to dynamically update that image if we want. Okay, so just to show you an example of adding to the UI with this syntax, again, for those basic things that we'd want to add, we just separate them by commas. Okay? So in this case, I'm creating a fluid page. I don't have a title bar for this one. I just have a sidebar layout that needs two things, one a panel for the sidebar and one a panel for the main area. Within each one of those, I can put whatever of those 4 types of things we talked about in here. So I'm having some formatted text here, and then I'm separating that with my widget with a comma. So formatted text, comma, a widget for the user to deal with, a numeric input. The first argument here is the internal name of that, and then the label that the user actually sees. This is the default value for that numeric input. Then I'm having a comma after that widget to add another one, slider input, internal name, label the user sees, default values for these, including sort of the range for it, min and max, etc., etc. BR is just a line break. A is a hyperlink. And then that finishes off my sidebar panel. Okay. From there, I now have my main panel, and now I'm going to actually output things from my server file. So within my server file, I'm creating a plot called data plot. I'm creating some text output called data info, and I'm creating a data table output with data table. And so I'm just, again, separating these with commas. And this is a case where it's really, really getting to be important that you use proper programming techniques for layout, right? So notice that I have these things tabbed in appropriately, and that can really help you to navigate where things end and where parentheses line up. So my sidebar panel starts here. Everything within my sidebar panel is tabbed in, and then my sidebar panel ends here. Now I have a comma to separate my sidebar layout elements, my sidebar panel and my main panel. And so this would be the output that you see there. So again, we have some formatted text. We have a numeric input here with a default value of 10. We then have a slider input here. And we have basic text and a hyperlink. That was all in the sidebar panel here. Notice that there's a space here before that hyperlink. No, it didn't show up. Interesting. Maybe it did and it's just not very big. I'll check on that. And then over here on the right, we have our main panel part. And so the main panel had 3 things, a plot, text, and then data table. So here is the plot. And notice when I change these things, it's generating some data and plotting a simple linear regression line. Below that, I have some text. And this is changing based off of my inputs here. And then I have a table of the data that, since it's one of these DT tables, I can easily manipulate and search through. Okay, so hopefully you're getting pretty excited about these Shiny apps. They're a little bit complicated to wrap your head around, but they're really cool once you can figure it out. So what we dealt with in this video is just sort of the basic ideas and then how the user interface works. So the user interface controls that layout of your app, a very basic layout that we're going to use for the first little bit here, just a sidebar panel and a main panel. And then within that, you can have basically 4 different things. You can have just regular strings of text, formatted strings of text, widgets, and then output from the server. We just separate those items by commas, and now you are ready to go ahead and try to set up your first user interface. So after this video, there's a link for homework. You'll need to complete that homework to get access to the next video. You don't need to complete that homework correctly, you just need to submit something to it. So go ahead and give that a shot, and then you can move on to the next video.